Let me invite you to take a seat so that we can begin. Carol? We're a little short of chairs. There are some chairs over on the side here, and we're trying to get somebody else to set up a few more. So I want to welcome all of you to this forum. This is a forum as part of an ongoing series of things we do here at All Souls Unitarian Church about once a month. And we're very pleased to be able to do a joint venture with our friends from the Center for Inquiry. On occasion, this is maybe our third or fourth venture like this as a joint venture, so that's been a very happy arrangement that we've been able to do with each other. I'm going to introduce the Executive Director of the Center for Inquiry, Michael Dodori, who's going to just say a word about the center, and then I will introduce Susan Jacoby, who will be our moderator today.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. So yes, we are extraordinarily thankful to have the relationship with All Souls Unitarian Church. I'd also like to thank the speakers for coming here tonight. I know Bill Lobdell came from California, actually, so we appreciate that. Also want to thank the volunteers, Center for Inquiry volunteers, who helped make this kind of event possible. And of course, I want to thank Susan Jacoby, who's the program director of the Center for Inquiry in New York City, and helps me put on these sorts of events. So just quickly, what is the Center for Inquiry? The Center for Inquiry is a think tank devoted to fostering a secular society based on science, reason, free inquiry, and humanist values. We do that in a couple different ways, but locally, the Center for Inquiry in New York City does that by having public lectures, such as this one, and also by having social events, so providing people a sense of community, very much like churches do. Now, the Center for Inquiry, as a nonprofit, is of course going through some tough times due to the economy, and as always, depends on people to fund our organization and our activities. So if you were at all interested in the Center for Inquiry's work and making sure that our work continues, at least in New York City, if not throughout the country, and continues to grow, the best way for you to do that would to become a friend of the center, which is our yearly membership. Costs $60, and you get a bunch of kind of CFI lapel pins and things like that. But you also get the knowledge that you're helping a great organization. And I think when you start to kind of rationalize it, and you think about all these events are basically free, and we're giving them to the public, and we're trying to raise consciousness and awareness to these sorts of issues, I think a $60 membership starts to look pretty attractive, actually. So you might want to think about that. You can talk to me after the event if you're interested in that, or you can talk to Scott. Oh, maybe I'm not talking loud enough? I apologize. You can talk to me. I'll raise my hand. You could also talk to Scott. He'll raise his hand. He's in charge of the Friend of the Center campaign for us. So this very quickly before I hand it back to David, I just want to tell you about our next two events to give you an idea of the kind of stuff that we also do. December 9th, we're doing an event in Brooklyn, way out in Brooklyn, Littlefield Performance and Art Space. I can give you more information about that later, but it'll be Wednesday, December 9th at 8 p.m. We're hosting Haroon Bacha, the singer the Taliban tried to silence. He's one of Pakistan's most celebrated singers, but he's run out of Pakistan by the Taliban, and this will be his first performance in America, actually. And that event will be co-sponsored with Free Muse and hosted by Austin Dacey, who some of you might know. And the other event, which will be our next big public lecture in New York City, will be our Thomas Paine Memorial Lecture, which will be January 20th, exactly 1 year since Obama took office, I believe. And Eric Alterman, who's a distinguished professor of English and journalism at Brooklyn College and a media columnist for The Nation magazine, will talk for us. He's also the author of Why We're Liberals, which I just picked up and started reading. It's a fantastic book. And that will be January 20th at the New York Society for Ethical Culture across town. If you have any questions about any of the events that I just mentioned or any other events, please talk to me or visit our website, centerforinquiry.net/New York City. Without further ado, now I'll hand it back to David Robb. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Well, this I think will prove to be a lively evening. How I survived my religious upbringing and education. I'm going to introduce the moderator for this event, Susan Jacoby, and she was the person who basically organized it. Susan is the program director for the Center for Inquiry. She's also a distinguished journalist and author. She began her career with the Washington Post and as a reporter, and she is the author of several books, now one of which I see on the table back here, The Age of Unreason. She's also written a book called Freethinkers, A History of American Secularism, and most recently, Alger Hiss and the Battle for History, which was published about a year ago. So, Susan Jacoby, thank you very much. We're delighted to have you and to have you moderate this event.
Thank you. I'm not going to do much moderating. We're just going to have people talk. We deliberately chose this date about a week before Hanukkah and several weeks before Christmas because during this holy holiday season, or hellish, depending on your point of view, we assume that there are probably a good many people, both in the All Souls congregation and among our members at CFI, most of whom I would say are atheists, who will have a lot of issues surrounding family and religion at this time of year. If you no longer practice the religion of the family into which you were born, there tends to be quite a bit of, stress around the holidays that family members no longer celebrate in quite the same religious fashion. I think this is also a time when people who have moved from a very strict form of faith, either to a more liberal religion or who've left religious belief completely behind, we think a lot about what these journeys have meant in our lives. And tonight we have three fantastic speakers who are going to talk about this issue from very different perspectives. I'm going to introduce them all now. Each of them will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll get down to a panel discussion and a lively exchange with the audience. Afterwards, by the way, all of these authors' books will be available for sale over there, and the authors will be available to sign their books. Our first speaker will be William Lobdell, the author of Losing My Religion, How I Lost My Faith Reporting on Religion in America and Found Unexpected Peace. Lobdell is a former religion reporter for the Los Angeles Times and was raised as a Roman Catholic, and his book was published by HarperCollins last year. I'll just read you one quote from the Times about his book. "There are a great many books about finding God," the reviewer observed, "but there are far fewer books, great or otherwise, about finding and losing God." Our second speaker is Marilyn Mayer, a member of the All Souls congregation. Marilyn is the president of the board of directors of the Unitarian Universalist United Nations office. She was raised as a strict Mormon and eventually found a new spiritual home in the Unitarian Universalist community. At a session of the UU General Assembly last June, Mayer addressed her own intellectual evolution in a speech called Lessons of a Mormon Childhood, My Journey from Temple Square to UN Plaza. Our final speaker is Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein, who is the acclaimed author of the novel The Mind-Body Problem, which I have to say is one of my favorite novels of all time, and most recently Betraying Spinoza, the renegade Jew who gave us modernity. Her next book is a novel, and it's called 36 Arguments for the Existence of God, a Work of Fiction. This will be published next month, and while unfortunately it's not available for sale, I should tell you, being an author myself, it is available for pre-order on Amazon.com. Goldstein is a philosopher with a particular interest in science, was raised in a tradition of strict Orthodox Judaism, and is now an atheist. In 1996, she was the recipient of a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, popularly known as the Genius Award. And with that, I will retire and turn this over to Bill Lobdell, our first speaker. I'm sure you'll remember all of the biographical details.
Thanks, Susan. I got into town last night and I went out with some friends. Very late. You in New York?
Why don't you go speak at
Oh, you want me to? Okay.
the stairs, unfortunately, are only over here.
So you New Yorkers like to stay out late. So we're out and they said, what are you doing? What are you doing? Who are you speaking to? I said, oh, I'm speaking to a bunch of atheists. And they said, where? And I said, at the Unitarian Church. They said, why would they go to a church to have you speak? I said, well, the Unitarian Church is not really a church. It's sort of, it's like non-alcoholic beer. Okay. Anyway, I love the Unitarian Church. I originally did survive my religious education as a kid. I grew up as a minor league Catholic, as an Episcopalian. And I went to church every week and just didn't get a lot out of it. I was crucifer. The rituals were there, but it didn't grab me. It didn't have any impact on me. So as soon as I could stop going to church, I stopped going to church. And then went to college, married my crazy high school sweetheart who continued to be crazy after I got married. And then I left her. I got a girl pregnant. My career was in the toilet, and I was just in extreme depression. And I finally told someone about it, one of my best friends, and he looked at me and said, you know what's missing in your life, Bill, is God. And I didn't laugh. If he would have said crack cocaine, I would have smoked it with him then. But he said God, and he said, I'm going to take you to church. And so took me to church, and it was different than my Episcopal upbringing. It was a mega church, and they had just sort of little kettles of coffee. They had cappuccino machines and lattes, and they had sort of donuts. They had croissants and scones, and instead of the organ, they had a great rock band. Instead of a boring minister up there, or a priest up there, they had this amazing speaker. And I fell in love with it because I had nothing else to. I thought I had nothing else to hang my life on. And so here was this religion that taught me that there was a father figure that loved me unconditionally no matter what. There was a owner's manual, this Bible, that showed me exactly how to live my life. I was surrounded by people who cared about me, and so I decided I'd do whatever they said I would do. So I went into prayer groups, I went into retreats. I read all the Christian apologists because I didn't want to just believe. I wanted to find factual evidence for my belief. And I was a journalist. And so as I was diving into this religious community that was very new to me, I realized that it wasn't being very well reflected in mainstream journalism, which doesn't really treat, even to this day, doesn't really treat religion very well, and because it's very foreign to most journalists. Most newsrooms are fairly godless, and they don't get religion. And so I began to think that God had a calling for me to be a religion writer. And so I prayed about that, and I prayed for 4 years, just morning, noon, and night. Let me become a religion writer for the LA Times. That was my prayer. So after 4 years of prayer, I decided maybe I should do something about it instead of just praying. So I met with the Times editors, and I said, what if I told you that that there is an organization that draws 20,000 people a weekend and in Orange County, and you don't cover it? And LA Times editors, probably like New York Times editors, but they're very arrogant. And they said, that's impossible. That can't happen. It's like a Mighty Ducks game happening in our nose, or Ducks game happening in our nose, and we would just know about it. And they said, well, it's Rick Warren's church, Saddleback Church. This is in 1998, and you guys haven't written a single word about it. And it's not because they were anti-Rick Warren Church, it's because they just didn't know about it. It was just a blind spot. And so she asked me other things they were missing. I gave her a list of 20 stories. So I got hired on as a part-time columnist for them, and eventually, after about a year and a half, they hired me on full-time. So I thought, man, God, he's a little slow, but he answered my prayers. And so I began this dream job where I was working 40, 50, 60 hours a week on any religion story in the nation. And it was at a time where newspapers mattered, and so I'd get called back, and I could basically do whatever I wanted. I could travel the nation. It was wonderful. And then the Catholic sex scandal came, and I worked on that full time. We don't have enough time to go into it, but if you deal with day in and day out hundreds of victims of sexual abuse, the effects, and then you get lied to by the bishops, archbishops, cardinals, their attorneys. The other day, they filed for bankruptcy up in Delaware, and the church, I don't know if he's the vicar, he was some church official with the Wilmington diocese, and they're in bankruptcy court, and they were discussing something, and he said, I don't know if we should discuss this, because I see just a room filled with, and it was all the sexual abuse victims, I just see a room filled with liability here. And that's how they view the victims, as sort of liabilities. So this, over the course of covering this, I found myself, I stopped going to church. I made up excuses why to myself, that I was, I had worked full time covering religion. I covered all the time. I needed a break on the weekends. And this is for 10, 15 years. That was a sole focus of my life. Was Sundays was going to church. Wednesdays was going to church. Maybe even Mondays sometimes. I felt weird praying. I felt like I was sort of a mental patient talking to myself. And I started to think, okay, I'm going through this dark night of the soul, and I'm being tested, and I need to get this change. So I decided that I'm an investigative journalist, and this is one of my problems was, on the religion beat, I had this knack of uncovering scandal, and when you're covering faith, there's no lack of scandal and hypocrisy. And so my career was soaring because I'd get these stories across the nation. Stories like, and this one never published, but I love this story, is there was this fairly famous evangelical pastor, and he would travel the world, and he had a special assistant, a male assistant, and they would travel the world, and to save money, of course, they stay in the same hotel rooms. And it turned out that he had fallen and was having a homosexual affair. So the board of elders suspended him and sent him to rehab to be fully reinstated as a heterosexual. And and of course they fired his assistant. So his assistant went on and found a new boyfriend and is living a fine life. And when the pastor came back as full man again, he found out about what his assistant was living with another guy, and he was enraged. So he decided to hire a hitman. And his big mistake is he hired a Mormon hitman. And they don't make the best killers. And so they, before the hit could be carried out, the Mormon hitman had a change of heart. And so he went to the police with all the evidence, and he went to me with all the evidence. So I've heard these tapes of wanting to knock off his. For some reason, the police have not, or the prosecutors have not come down on this guy yet. And I don't know why, but something I'm going to check. But those are the kind of stories that I got, and they were just wonderful stories, but they weren't good for my faith. And I soon found out that religious organizations, they were no different than Enrons and the AIGs. And in fact, a lot of cases they were worse because they could say, they're taking the direction from God. And there were no rules and regulations over them. The First Amendment is wonderful, but it also gives them extraordinary freedom to do whatever they want and tremendous abuse. So I decided as an investigative journalist, I'm going to prove that my faith was real. And so I decided in my simple little mind that if Christianity, my faith, were true, that Christians would act differently, superior morally, to atheists. And I thought it would be a long, exhaustive search, and so I headed out on that. It took me about 5 minutes on the internet, and it turns out that every study shows that there's no difference, and in fact, in many regards, atheists act better morally than Christians do. And Christians their divorce rate is higher, they're more racist, but they're basically the same. Then I thought prayer, we all pray, there's got to be evidence, and again, 5 minutes on the internet shows that there's no studies that show prayer works, and in fact, the latest study shows that if you're in the hospital and you're being prayed for, and you have a heart condition, you end up being worse because there's so much pressure to get better that so don't pray for people is the thing. So everywhere I turned to gather faith, and then I did a real critical analysis of the Bible, which, that fell apart very quickly. And so everywhere I turned to shore up my faith, it pointed in a different direction. And this is over a course of maybe 4 years where I'm having this crisis of faith. And finally, I saw Julius Sweeney's play, Letting Go of God. I didn't know what it was about, and I'm sure many of you have seen it. If you haven't, you can get it on the internet, and it's wonderful. But as she sat there, this person that was, normal, funny, caring, everything else, and she talked about her journey, I had goosebumps the whole time because I hadn't heard this before, because this is before Hitchens and Sam Harris. And it was like, oh my God, someone can be a regular person and be an atheist and have a fulfilled life. And that just wasn't in my worldview at that time. And so I came home and decided, for better or for worse, I was an atheist. And and when we're talking tonight, what people who are longtime atheists don't either remember or never remember, because they were never believers, is that it's very, very hard to give up your faith because you have so much invested in it. It's your worldview. It's the way you raise your kids. It's the way your whole culture is. I came from recently from an ex-Mormon conference, and there were speakers and other things, but the most moving part of it, and these are 300 to 400 people, maybe 500 people, was they had these testimonies, and these people got up and said, I could no longer believe, and I knew I was going to lose my husband or wife, my kids, my neighbors, my everything. I was going to be ostracized, but I couldn't live a lie anymore, and I had to come out. And there's a big price that people pay for doing that, especially the more, whether it's Mormon or Roman Catholics or Orthodox Jews, that there's a huge price to pay a lot of times for coming out and saying, I don't believe. So it's easier, and there's sort of a childlike. For me, it was sort of a childlike feeling that I was being taken care of. I didn't have to worry about death. I'm going to live forever, and I could do whatever, and be forgiven. It was sort of a wonderful thing. But I found, in my case, I found that once I accepted it, that there was no God, my life changed, and it changed for the better. It was once I said, let go of God, everything seemed to make sense. The things that used to torture me, the basic questions, why do bad things happen to good people, et cetera, had just rational explanations. Shit happens, right? And that's just, there's no God that's ignoring it. Things just happen. And so for me, it was really freeing because I wasn't, all of a sudden the world made sense. It all kind of clicked in. And I was going to read you one thing from my book, which makes a fabulous holiday present for your Christian friends, especially Catholics. Oh, I was going to say is, what's happening in America right now is we are experiencing, I think, an awakening here. If you look at the poll results, you see a huge move from religious to non-religious. The number of atheists people have a hard time saying I'm an atheist, but many people are dropping out of organizing religion. The best statistic that I found recently is that 27% of Americans, though 98 or so say they believe in God, 27% say they do not want a religious funeral. And what does that say? Deep down, they don't believe. And I think the reason why Christians and atheists have the same behavior is deep down, Christians, for the most part, I think, don't believe. They don't believe their gospel. And so what you see with Hitchens and Harris and Dawkins and these battering rams is they've bashed down the door, and now people feel more socially acceptable and to come out and say, I don't really believe that stuff anymore. And it's amazing, as I went on this book tour, people would come up and they'd say, I've been thinking this for a long, long time, but I never put it all together. I never had the courage to come out. And so I think you're seeing a real shift in America. So I'll just close with, and you're also seeing, by the way, a rising tide of secular groups. The Center for Inquiry has been around for a long time, but you're seeing other groups that function very much like churches. One of the best questions I got on my book tour was, if you were hurting back in your 20s, and there wasn't the church, where would you go? It's a real fair question. I think atheism sort of matures and grows up and becomes more mainstream. One of the things that we need to do as a community is form different types of communities to address the needs that churches have done so well over the years. So this is my conclusion, or one of my conclusions in my book, but it says, among the things the Bible promises, peace and serenity, I found in larger measures as a non-believer. My morals and values haven't changed. I used to see my innate beliefs about right and wrong as something God-given. I now see them as a product of tens of thousands of years of evolution encoded in my DNA to best ensure the survival of my family and myself. A sociopath, not an atheist, has no conscience and no ability to tell right from wrong. As a believer, I try to live up to the standards for living outlined in the Bible, that is, the generous and loving parts of Scripture. Nothing has changed since my loss of faith. I still try to follow the same general ideals, morals and values that I'd argue are inherent to each human being. I still find myself stumbling, but now I don't blame Satan. Usually when I do wrong, it's due to selfishness and poor judgment overcoming common sense, self-restraint, and experience. Truth be told, my actions aren't much different from when I was a Christian. Many of my basic life struggles are the same. I still worry too much, hold grudges too long, lie, usually in small ways too easily, drink more than I should, I'm too impatient with the kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What's gone is the placebo of faith that was supposed to transform me into a better person, to protect me, to guide me, and eventually to usher me into heaven. The placebo had stopped working long ago, and when I admitted that I'd been taking the sugar pill of faith, relief swept over me. My increasing doubts about Christianity had not been a sign of weakness or lack of faith or skirmish with the devil. I had only been slowly, even unconsciously, headed for the truth. What has taken the place of God in my life? A tremendous sense of gratitude. I sense how fortunate I am to be alive in this thin sliver of time in the history of the universe. This gives me a renewed sense of energy to live this short life well. I don't have eternity to fall back on, so my focus on the present has sharpened. I find myself being more grateful for each day and more quickly making corrections in my life to avoid wasted time. I've tightened my circle of friends, wanting to maximize time with the people I love and enjoy the most. I've become more true to myself because I'm not as worried about what others think of me. This may be due in part to maturity, but it also has to do with knowing what's of real importance in my one and only life. The sound of a ticking clock counting down the minutes of my life is now nearly impossible to get out of my head. This isn't a bad thing. It's the background beat to a well-lived life. Thanks.
Well, you never know what you're going to learn. As an ex-Mormon, I had no idea that there were meetings where people got up and bore their testimonies about why they're not Mormons any longer. And it's amazing how in leaving an organization, you borrow from it, because one of the time-honored traditions in the Mormon Church is the first Sunday of every month. It's a fast and testimony Sunday. And so you don't eat that day, and as part of the services, there's an opportunity to stand up and bear your testimony.
Was not allowed to be heard outside of her family. And we were a very musical family. My father was, in fact, a cantor, my cousin. And we all sing. Music was very important. And this was always, I was very aware, like when I was in services, and sometimes I would get carried away by the music, and I would start singing aloud. And, my mother, shh, they'll hear you, even though, of course, we were all the way sequestered away from the men. But this notion of sort of modesty is very, very deeply bred into girls who are raised as I was raised. And perhaps, this sort of has something to do with this. I don't know. The other thing is, and this I only realized quite recently, I was on a panel for PEN, the writing organization, international, and the panel was called, Do You Believe? And it turned out all of us on the panel was a bunch of writers. I was the only American, the rest were all European. None of us believed, and all of us had lost our belief at about the same age, 13, 14, something like that. And I was the only American, I was the only woman, I was the only Jew on the panel, and the other writers spoke about it was so empowering to lose their religion and to be a free thinker because they had all grown up in countries in which their religion was the dominant religion and was part of the power structure. It was part of the rebellion against the power structure. I mean, all writers want to be, subversive, we all are subversive. All writers are by nature subversive. And that this was, a wonderful kind of rebellion and, stick it to the man. And I realized how different it felt for me. For me, growing up, not as a member of a dominant culture, but somebody who was very, very aware of how marginalized we were, among a bunch of Holocaust refugees who had been, really victimized for this. For me, it felt like, and still feels like, and I think that's part of why I'm still pulling the Band-Aid off. It feels like a betrayal of this history, of this tragic history, a history that I sympathize with so much. So Marilyn, when you spoke about leaving behind the story that you're not wanting to leave behind the story that you're proud of, I mean, I don't know that I'm proud of the story, but I feel a lot for this story, and I don't, and it feels like betrayal. And so it's still a conflicted issue for me. I am now an atheist. I have left it. And how did I finally leave it? Well, when my daughters, with whom I had always tried, even though they were going to the school, and I didn't want to confuse them too much, but I tried to be as honest as I could with them, as much as they could take of it. And it varied with them, how much they could take and at what age. When they decided, when the first one went off to college and decided, after 1 week of being at college, that she was an atheist, and the younger one had decided that long ago, I thought, well, and my parents were already gone, it's like, all right, so who am I doing this for now? This is just becoming ridiculous. And it is wonderful to bring the two parts together, my thinking life and the way I live. But it was really my daughters who gave me the permission to do that. I ought to say that when my daughter went off to college, my oldest daughter, my mother, who was still alive then, offered her $10,000 not to major in philosophy, saying, look what it did to your mother, even though I was still making Pesach, I was still cooking, But anyway, it was, and I write a little bit about this, but I've never really told the story until tonight, because it's, to me, such a story of compromise and dishonesty and accommodation and hypocrisy and cowardice But okay, it took a while, but here it is. I'll tell a little bit about it, though, in Betraying Spinoza. When I published that book, something interesting happened, which, it was my 8th book already, but something interesting happened, which was I started to get invitations from places like Center for Inquiry or various atheist congregations. There's an atheist Jewish congregation in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I live in Boston, and to speak there, and this was so fascinating to me. Organized non-religion seemed, for me, one of the wonderful things about leaving religion was I didn't have to go to a set community anymore, where I was supposed to have something in common with these people just because we were born into the same group. But this was a different kind of thing. These were people who were brought together because of the beliefs that they had arrived at. And that's been a very, very interesting thing to me. And I've gotten pulled into the current debate, very lively debate between science and religion and faith and reason. So much so that I thought, somebody really ought to write a novel about this. Some books I write are philosophy. That seems the right thing to do. And sometimes novel seems the right way. And the thing that was getting me, and I'm very, very good friends with Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris. I'm on Sam Harris's board, his Reason Project board. Dan Dennett, also a very good friend. But one of the things that none of them knows is what it feels like to be religious. They really don't know what religion feels like from the inside. To them, it's just, how could anybody believe this nonsense? But to be a member of a community and to identify yourself with this community and to feel the support of this community around you, to identify with its history, this wider family, these are very, very powerful emotions. And so you can be a free thinker and still be drawn to this community. And so in trying to explain to them, especially to Dan Dennett, what it feels like to be within this community, and he's just looking at me like, I thought you were a philosopher. How can you? I thought, this is something where fiction can do what philosophy can't do. Because what fiction does do is bring the reader into the inner world, what the world feels like for other people. So it seemed to me that was exactly the next thing that I had to do, and that's the novel that is not yet for sale, but is for sale, pre-order, 36 Arguments for the Existence of God, a work of fiction. Anyway, thank you very much.
This is a time when I would normally start to moderate a discussion, but I suspect that a lot of people are going to have questions for this panel. So I'd like to open up the floor. There's a microphone right there for questions, and I will only quote moderate a discussion if none of you have anything to ask. Because I found all of these stories so interesting that I don't want to preempt you with my concerns.
Hi. So thank you, first of all, for all three of you. It's fantastic discussion. I'm going to do something that I usually hiss at other people for doing, is ask two questions. One is, what would you suggest to someone who is trying to reach out to their family who is religious? I come from a religious background. In terms of talking to them and trying to bring them towards a free thinker point of view. And the second question is, what would all of you suggest in terms of creating the community that you were talking about in a religious organization? What would you suggest for the free thinker community in terms of creating that sense of community for us? So those are my questions. Thank you.
You might buy them a copy of Bertrand Russell's Why I Am Not a Christian. There are now so many good books out, it seems to me, that, there are, that, of course, that was my way. I came to it by way of books. One of the things I think that is so important one of the fallacies, I don't dislike religion or religious communities. Some of my favorite people in the world, my family, are very, very religious, and they have worked to accept me. But one of the things that really, really drives me crazy, and I write about this a lot in the new novel, is the assumption that there is a problem with morality once you take God out of the equation. And, William had spoken about this. But it's such a very, very, it's so wrong, and it's such a bad, bad, bad argument. Plato showed us before Christianity even got started that you can't found morality on God. It's a knockdown argument, the argument in the Euthyphro. And I have gotten someplace with some people that I talk to with this, because that notion of that you can't trust someone who isn't religious, or you can't trust somebody who belongs to another religion. I mean, this is not just wrong. This is pernicious. This is destroying our planet. This is really something that has to, I think we all have to go after that very, very false belief that religion helps in any way with morality. Quite the contrary, I would say.
To the your first question, I think that it depends on where your loved ones or friends are. I have a brother-in-law who's just a crazy evangelical Christian. So when I sort of came out of the closet, soon after my son, my 15-year-old son then got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So he very helpfully called and said the reason why I got diabetes is because I lifted God's protection on our house. That's actually good because I don't have to talk to that a-hole again. But anyway, I think part of the problem that atheists have, I know, but when I came out of the closet and I did a story for the Times. It was a 3,000-word essay that ran the front page, and I got literally 3,000 emails. It's the most in the LA Times history because people want to talk about doubt, right? The only and these are Christians, everybody, the only really vicious emails I got were from atheists who said, how can you be so stupid to waste your entire adult life believing in something that I found out when I was 3 years old or whatever the age is. So, I think you got to, you can't have that same irritating superiority that some religious people do. I think it's basically coming alongside people and just loving them, engaging them in conversations, etc. On the sense of community, and this always gets me in trouble in atheist group, but there's sort of a vibe in atheist groups. It's sort of academia meets Star Wars, or Star Trek, it needs to get more mainstream. It needs to get more, less park protectors and more, just regular folks. And there's a couple organizations in Boston. There's a great organization called, it's called Skeptics in the Pub. And they meet in the pub, and there's a bunch of organizations all around the country like that. They're doing remarkable things. There's a great group in Nashville that attracts a very young, hip crowd. So they're sort of like the new, they're not mega churches, but the emerging churches. So I think it needs to get less of what's currently out there and more a better reflection of just the rest of America.
I would just like to, this is the only thing I'm going to add because it's very much on my mind. I write a blog for the Washington Post Newsweek called Secularist Corner. And in yesterday's post, I was asked about my views on the American Humanist Association bus ads, no God, no problem, you can be good without God. They're in cities all over the country, actually. And I have to say that I think that there is a problem talking just about atheists right now, completely secular organizations. In talking about communities, what I said on my blog was this, that I would rather see all that money they spent, saying, oh, we can be good too, which I think is a kind of obsequious posture. I no longer want to convince anybody, having been asked on the radio, what would stop me from committing murder if I didn't believe in God, which astonished me the first time I heard it. But I frankly think that money would be a lot better spent, since 40 million people are having trouble putting food on the table. Why not have a Freethinkers food pantry and do some of the kinds of things that churches do? Not to prove that you can be good without God, but it's a communal organization. I think this kind of combination of superiority, and I think it's just very obsequious to be constantly saying, oh, I'm really such a good girl, even though I don't believe in God. I think that one of the ways you can get community is by doing the things that communities do, and not just putting ads on bus signs. That's all I have to say.
Just one last comment on that question. I don't think you can change people very much unless they want to be changed. And unless people want to become more free thinking, they're not going to be. But if they see you and they see that your life is happy and you're enjoying yourself, you're a curious person, there may be some grounds to engage. But I wouldn't imagine that you can in some way convert them when they're not asking to be. I wouldn't want that for myself either.
Oh, well, first place, I really want to commend the panel. I think this has been a great discussion, probably one of the most interesting and stimulating that we've had in this series. And what you've said has been sufficiently exciting for me to want to take the effort to disagree a little bit. One of the things that I hold most against Orthodox religion and against biblical literalness is that it's given spirituality a bad name. And I take, for instance, exception to my friend from the LA Times. The first thing you said when you started your discussion, you said, this is not really a church. I'll correct you. This is a church, but it's a special kind of church. It's a place where there's room for reason and for spirit. And I think that while it's absolutely necessary to do what you guys did, which is to rebel against oppressive orthodoxy, I think in the process, we have to be very careful that we don't minimize or play down what seems to me a very important aspect of the human self, which is the spiritual side. Guys, and I'll wind up with this. Guys like one of former debating partner of mine, Christopher Hitchens, treats it as front page news that modern religion has not solved the problem of evil. It ain't news. The scholastics knew that in the Middle Ages. I'm sure Rebecca can testify. But maybe that's not what religion is supposed to do. Maybe it's supposed to do something else, and the neo-atheists are asking religion to do something that it really isn't supposed to do, and maybe that's the problem. There's room for spirituality, even for God. You know, a rabbi of my acquaintance was once asked, this is the last thing I'll say, a rabbi of my acquaintance was once asked, do you believe that God exists? His reply was, depends what you mean by believe, it depends what you mean by God, it depends what you mean by exists, and yes.
I've just come out of your talk, stimulated from your talk. I also admire Bertrand Russell's powerful book, Why I'm Not a Christian. And from that, also, particularly Bertrand Russell's book about, with Whitehead, with
Proof can be a mathematical.
mathematics can be reduced to logic final. Yeah. And it took only 10 pages of Kurt Gödel's theorem that punctures everything that they have done. And that genius, regretfully, is not an atheist. And they lived the last 20 years that Kurt Gödel and Einstein lived together.
Excuse me, I don't mean to be rude, but there are a lot of people waiting. I would hope people to ask some questions so
Yeah,
that
what,
the panel...
what, are you disappointed with that?
With Gödel's result?
With the fact that he's not an atheist.
Oh, Gödel.
Practically proved the other way.
Yeah. Well, Gödel was a very strange man. Actually, my book before Betraying Spinoza was a book about Gödel's incompleteness theorems. It was called Incompleteness, the Proof and Paradox of Kurt Gödel. Kurt Gödel was, so he and his friend Einstein, they were best friends at the Institute, and Einstein was a Spinozist, which is spirituality without religion, and Spinoza had shown that that can be done. And Gödel was more of a believer. Am I disappointed? No, Gödel was a great mathematician, one of the greatest mathematicians of the last century, but his genius was very localized. Newton was the same way. Sir Isaac Newton had, was a magnificent mind, but he had really weird ideas about theology and was using that great genius of his to try to predict the end of days. And so, the fact that people who are great geniuses in their particular field, and you can be a great genius in mathematics and be really clueless about everything else. I mean, mathematical genius is like that. That's why it interests me so much. Yeah, that he had these very weird views about, he believed in the afterlife and all sorts of things. Gödel, I look to Gödel for my math. I don't look to him for my theology or my philosophy.
My name is John. There's so many different religious traditions that you came from, and I'm curious if in your current state you sort of take effort to preserve certain ones or what ones they are.
Any
Traditions?
traditions? Yeah. I think he's saying, do you integrate some of your religious traditions in your life in another way?
No. It took for when I first came out, I had young kids, real young, or I sort of 2 kids, and then we waited and had 2 more. And we treated God like Santa Claus because I couldn't figure out how to tell them. I thought it was a horrible thing that I might be inflicting on them. As I got more comfortable, my lack of belief, we told them about that, and all the religious festivities, et cetera, just melted away.
I can't see any place where I do either.
Christmas tree?
Nope,
No Christmas
not
tree?
anymore. I did bring my partner to All Souls once on Christmas, thinking she might like the music. She said, talked about Jesus, didn't they? I'm not going back. I can take that, but I really don't incorporate any of those rituals any longer that I can think of in my life.
Yeah, nor I. For me, it was because it was either you take all of it or none of it. So, friends of mine who didn't grow up as religious as I, Jewish friends, will keep Passover, do something for Passover or Yom Kippur at least. No, for me, once I gave it up, it's all the same. I don't do anything.
I do have a statue of Snoopy playing the piano that is surrounded by Christmas lights that you push with a battery. I've had it for a long time.
As a member of this congregation for more than 50 years, I also would like to kind of quibble with the first speaker about this not being a church. And the minister of this church who just passed away after being minister for 30 years, one of the things he would say to people who came to see whether they wanted to join this church, that he would say to them, tell me what God you don't believe in, and I will tell you whether I believe in him either. And I think that this congregation is full of people who have different opinions about spirituality and about whether they believe in God or don't believe in God. But this is a church. And so I really would like to come to the defense of this congregation, because I think I'm surrounded here by people who really do not believe in any higher being at all. And so I'd like to just say that there are many of us here in this church who do.
Okay, listen, a poor attempt at humor. I have, when people think of a church, when my friends think of a church, they don't think of a place where atheists come and agnostics come and people that believe in God come. They don't understand the Unitarian church. So when I say it's not really a church, I'm talking to them. I've been a pastor or a speaker at Unitarian. I love Unitarian churches, so I'm sorry if I offended you. I didn't mean to.
Well, I just want to say that my background, my coming to this particular church, I came from a mixture of Catholicism and Judaism, and I am a Holocaust survivor. And when I came out of the war, I was looking for something other than Judaism and Catholicism. And I looked around for quite a long time. I looked at ethical culture, for example, and it wasn't spiritual enough for me. So I found a home here. And I just want to say that there are a lot of people in this particular congregation who have the same beliefs that I have. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Renee, and I'm a secular humanistic Jew who belongs to a community of atheistic, agnostic Jews who make a community and do the kinds of things, social action things, educating our children, and I think it is possible to find that kind of a community. But my question is more about, to Rebecca. So your children ended up agreeing with you. Obviously, there was some sort of conflict with your first husband. You didn't talk about that? Is that because you're being private about it, or because you ran out of time?
Well, Sheldon Goldstein, my former husband, a great physicist, I ought to say, a brilliant physicist, a very compartmentalized person. So he has an extremely critical intelligence, which was never directed to religion. And it was just off the table. It was not, we didn't speak about it. So this is a person who can tear everything to pieces that doesn't make sense. And yet, this way of life it couldn't be spoken about. So, and I think that that's not unusual for, I know many highly developed minds who just refuse to ask the questions. And in fact, I mean, that's basically what one is trained to do in Judaism. It's a very intellectual religion. You know, what my relatives do, what my male relatives do, is they sit and learn. All they do is study, study, study. They're perpetual graduate students. It's an entirely intellectual life, but it's very, very circumscribed. There are certain, you ask the questions that you're supposed to ask, and you don't ask them outside. And that's the way it was in my family as well, my first family as well.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the panelists for a very stimulating discussion. I'd like to ask Mr. Lobdell, the Protestant fundamentalist churches frequently refer to the Catholic Church as Antichrist. They say that the Catholic Church is the Antichrist. I mean,
Not anymore.
Okay, but I'm sure there are churches out there. Did they attempt to use that angle on you when you were investigating all the child sex abuse scandals? Did they go and say, did you go to a pastor and say, they just said, well, those Catholics are all corrupt, and this is yet another sign of their depravity, and that they're not in communion with Jesus, and that they are Antichrist? I mean, and how did you react to that, or why did you not pick up on that?
Yeah, I think that's a typical reaction among, especially conservative evangelicals, is the Catholic Church has some fundamental problems and is heretical in a lot of its teaching. Yeah, it does. Yeah, a lot of its teachings. So that would be their explanation. In my ultimate wisdom, I decided when I was evangelical that it didn't have enough depth for me, and so I started to become a Catholic at the same time I was reporting on the sex scandal. So I would go to, talk about compartmentalize, I would go to spend all day reporting on this tremendous scandal. And by the way, when people say there are good priests out there, there, in the whole United States, there's maybe 6 priests that turned in a brother priest who was molesting kids, but they all knew what was going on. So I don't buy that. So I spent all day reporting on that, and then at night I'd go to the conversion classes, because if you're going to become a big league Catholic, it takes a year to do that. So I'd go to conversion classes on weeknights and on the weekends, and then I'd report on the weekday. I didn't, for some reason, I thought those paths would never cross, but they did.
One thing that I've seen on the internet is Professor Peter Atkins, who's a noted atheist common champion or whatever, or advocate. He says that religion traps people, that and what I think is that the ideas and the memes of religion have evolved over time so that they do trap people. They trap people, into believing the fear of death. They trap people into compartmentalizing their lives, into all of this irrationality and, fear for your children, fear for your children's souls, your parents. I just, wondering if any of you would like to comment on that.
Well, I don't know that religion creates fear of death and fear for one's children. I think it preys on it, P-R-E-Y, not P-R-A-Y. That's what, Hobbes, who gave a very, very deep analysis of religion, said, it does really start with fear. And the ironic thing is that it then it fans up the fear. It makes it's stronger. So you're not worrying just about this life and the terrible things that can happen, but the afterlife as well. And trying to appease this God to ensure that everything will go well.
Following a whole set of rules that, there's no other reason to follow the rules other than the rules are there.
Yeah, so it's, there is a tremendous amount of fear, but there's a lot more than just fear as well.
I'd like to just say that getting out of a fundamentalistic religion is similar to getting out of a cult. Yes, it is a cult. And I think the process needs to be done very carefully, because I think that it is so encompassing and so much a part of your life that it's very easy to see people crack as a result. Everything is questioned, gone. And I really urge people who are contemplating leaving to have this, as I said, a Sherpa, someone to guide them out of it, some support in doing so, because your whole life is so wrapped up in it.
Thank you. Someone once said that religion began to die about 300 years ago with the advent of modern science. Do you think that this is true? And where do you see religion in 50, 60, 100 years as science advances? Thank you.
Anyone?
Well, yeah, I guess it's true, right? I mean, it was, the Age of Enlightenment and it begins with the 17th century and a new notions of what evidence is, what it is to ground your beliefs, and we're led there by modern philosophy and by science. And science is, it's transformed the planet for better or for worse. It really works. We've got real knowledge here. We know what knowledge looks like, and it's certainly, I think that is when it started to die. And one of the, it would never will. My very utopian atheist friends, Hitchens and Dawkins and Dennett, who think that they're going to write these books and, break the spell, as Dennis, it's not going to happen. I mean, religion is answering to some very, very deep needs. And I keep thinking back to your question, what can we do to try to serve those needs? I know that, for example, when I had many losses, many deaths in my family, and the community, that was the time when I really loved being part of that community. They took care of us. We didn't cook, we didn't do any, they were there day and night taking care of us. And that also is something that is provided by having a community like this, and that we all need desperately, So there's something to think about.
Yeah, I'd like to add something to that. I quite agree. I mean, Dawkins and Hitchens are never going to convince people to stop believing in religion. I don't believe that no girl was ever ruined by a book, but I don't believe anybody was ever, I have reason to think, in fact, perhaps she was. Girls are ruined by books, and boys too. But I don't think, I really think that there's something, the question about fear of death. But religion serves another need too, and it's really why evolution wasn't just troubling to people because it undermined literal biblical notions. Plenty of churches, such as the Unitarians, such as Catholics, for heaven's sakes, are able to reconcile evolution with belief that a God set the universe in motion. But I think one of the great needs that religion serves, and I don't really see religion, I see religion and what people call spirituality as serving essentially a same need, which is to believe in human exceptionalism. Once you accept evolution fully, and I think this is why evolution is always so troubling, you can never think of yourself again as a special creation. And one of the reasons that I think that religion won't die is one sees this all the time at meetings of scientists when biologists will talk to groups of psychologists in particular. I've been present at some of these discussions. And if biologists say that everything from spirituality to love is a product of the brain, a physical organ, the psychologists are wounded. And because they want to believe that human emotions come from some other place separate from the brain. Now, for all of these things that I've heard, I don't understand quite why people are offended at the idea that it's our brains, which are a physical organ, that emotions come from, and all of the higher things that we think of as setting humans apart from the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, but they do. And in that respect, I think, I think it's just a kind of, in a scientific veneer, the same need that some kinds, not all kinds, some kinds of religions serve, which is to make us think that we are more than we are. That to have this physical brain and what it does is not enough, and it somehow demeans human beings not to think, in other words, to think that even if you don't believe in God, that that the mind is different from the brain. No, I don't believe the mind. The mind is the mind, what we call the mind, what makes us think about religion, what makes us do science, what makes us do literature. This is all a product of this brain. And I feel more strongly about this than ever. So I don't think it's death. I think it's also, we have a really high opinion of ourselves. And it's not just religious community and certainty that's difficult to give up. It's our own really elevated opinion of who we are.
Interesting.
I never said that before, and I realize that I deeply, deeply believe it. We'll take two more questions, and then our authors will sign books I see a lot of people bought books and had to leave without signing. So two more questions.
Okay.
And I won't say
You
another
talked
word.
exquisitely, all three of you, about the bad news and getting away from. I'd like you to explore the good news of what you're reaching for. Give us some good news, something to reach for rather than just get away from. What's the good news?
Come on, you guys.
Give us something to believe in.
I've already talked about that, community, being part of a group in which I'm not expected to think in a certain way, having freedom, and still being accepted as I am. Someone asked a question, well, where's the glue that holds people together if you don't have religion? And I think it's common purpose, interests, affection, all the kinds of things that draw us together, but without some sense that God is telling us to do these things. I think these things are part of our wiring, and I don't reject that personality is in the brain. I think that our personalities are different because our biological framework is different, and our experiences are too. I think, just going back to this other question, which intrigued me, comment, I think psychologists reject a mechanistic view of human development, but I say myself that personality is located in the brain, where else, and is a result of our complexity of experience. So in that sense, I would differ from these other psychologists, just answering two questions at once.
I wish you were there at this. I talked about it. I read from my book some of the things, but for me, it was exhilarating to finally face the truth and to understand what that meant in my life. And I ran away in a whole bunch of different areas, and sometimes when I look back on my life, it's like reading a love note you might have wrote in high school. It's embarrassing, but there's a wonderful freedom to embrace the truth wherever that leads you.
But that's your truth, not necessarily everyone.
My truth, right?
The truth
There's
will
only
make you free.
I mean, there's so much good news that I don't even know where to begin. But one of the things is, and I guess it's also what you're talking about here, the experience of gaining objectivity is such a wonderful experience, of making progress. You see why you believed what you believed before, and why it's no longer true, and you're widening your understanding in such a way that you can take into account your former point of view and see, that's such a wonderful experience. It's such a growing, expansive experience. The other thing also is, the universality of our human experience, that often religion should not get in the way of it, but it often does as it's practiced. And so that, I belong to my group, there's them and there's us, and to hear a Mormon speak and say, yes, that's exactly how I felt too, this wonderfully expansive commonality that I've experienced since I've left that community is also a joyous thing, a blessed
Universality. Thank you, Rebecca.
Okay, final question.
I have a kind of run-on sentence here, but I'd like to read it as it is because I tried to make sure I asked exactly what I wanted to.
I can't hear a word.
Aside from organized religion, did any of you ever have what seemed to be a deeply personal, spiritual, or mystical experience that gave you doubt as an atheist that maybe there was a higher power of some sort?
No.
Deeply personal or mystical experience. Anybody up there ever have that?
I have. I discount it.
Pardon me?
I don't. I can explain why it's happened, but I have had.
So if you
experiences.
if you feel that you can explain it, that it's not mystical or spiritual.
No, but in the
because
grip of it.
Pardon me?
In the grip of the experience, while the experience was going on, yes. I mean, I'm half out of my mind most of the time.
Because I have struggled to be an atheist because for me it would have been easier. I've been an agnostic like 33 years, but I've had a couple experiences that were really shocking. I mean, one was going into the room of a woman who was dying the next day, of cancer, and there was this light in the room that was so big I was afraid to go in, 1989, July. And so, I've been angry with God if God exists, and I've been trying to say, you don't exist, I don't want to be bothered. But there's things that give me doubt because I've had some experiences in my life that are really surprising. And that's where I'm kind of like on the fence. And I've come to this church not because it's not a non-church, but because of the tolerance to believe as you really believe, wherever you are, whether you believe or you don't believe. And I left a church that I adored of 32 years because when they had a change of minister, they became narrowly Protestant. I joined as a professed agnostic. but it would be easier for me to be an atheist. I have tried to be an atheist. I was raised Roman Catholic. I was an angry little kid. I said, this is bullshit, when I was about 12 years old. But then I had this happen, and then that happened, and this happened, and I went, where did that come from? Some I could explain from my intuition, and some was outside myself.
Oh, there's much that can't be explained in general, and I think on that note, we'll close. Our authors will be there to sign if you wish to buy something. I want you to have your, a lot of people bought your books. I saw.
She should offer herself to science and let them, they're always looking. Oh,
You guys better go over and sign your books, or the bookseller will be gone before.
Okay.
Thank you. Absolutely.